Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great pleasure to museum future bodies from a recent past, sculpture, technology, and the body since the 1950s. My name is Patrizia Danda. I'm chief curator at the Museum Brandhorst, and I have co-organized the symposium with my colleague Franziska Lienhardt, whom you met earlier today. While the first two panels of our symposium yesterday and earlier today focused on artistic practices and developments from the 1950s and 1960s, we're now looking forward to two presentations that reflect on art historical narratives and on theories of sculpture in more general terms. The overall framework of our symposium and of the exhibition that will follow next year starts with the 1950s. This is the time when the transition from the so-called mechanical to the information paradigm established itself on a broader scale in Western industrial societies. Given its continued impact on our present-day configuration of technology, society, and the body, this is what we will focus on in terms of artists and artworks. Nonetheless, we are of course aware that sculpture has been affected by technological developments for much longer, and this is why it seemed important to expand the frame of discussion when looking at the theory of sculpture, and to reflect upon the impact of new technologies, in particular reproduction technologies, throughout the history of modern sculpture. As we know, the conventional art historical narrative proclaims that the 1960s witnessed the end of the classical sculpture idiom on both a practical and a theoretical level. Genre boundaries were broken up in favor of new media, techniques, and conceptual frameworks that dismantled the narrative for sculpture as an autonomous, self-contained entity. However, already in the 19th century, new reproduction technologies and materials, from rubber to the electrotype, had given rise to epistemological formations that destabilized conventional notions of the integrity of sculpture. Sculpture's materiality, scale, temporality, and site-specificity became portable and fluid way earlier than it would be discussed in our theory. With this in mind, it's of renewed interest to look at sculptural features such as spatiality, plasticity, form, and materiality, and the changes they were subjected to in parallel to an expanding array of reproduction techniques. We're excited to be joined by two fantastic colleagues tonight that will discuss the complex reconfigurations of the medium of sculpture with us. Ursula Ströbele is head of the Study Center for Modern and Contemporary Art at the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte here in Munich, and she's our cooperation partner in the symposium. Her presentation will be complemented by a lecture by Megan Luke, Associate Professor in Art History at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. We will actually start this evening with Ursula's presentation, followed by a lecture by Megan, and afterwards the two speakers will convene again to discuss their talks with one another before we open to questions. It's my great pleasure to now introduce Ursula Ströbele to this panel. Ursula is a research associate at the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte here in Munich, where she heads the Study Center on Modern and Contemporary Art. As said, she's our cooperation partner on this symposium, and as a complement to our program, she has organized two lectures on art and artificial intelligence with Christiane Paul and Mercedes Bunz at the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte, the second of which will take place next Wednesday, and I warmly recommend you check out Zentralinstitut's website for further details. In 2019, Ursula was curatorial director of the Kunstverein Arnsberg, and previously she worked at the Universität der Künste in Berlin from 2012 through 2018, where she co-founded the academic network Theory of Sculpture. Last year, the related publication Gegenstand Skulptur, Topic Sculpture, was published. Also in 2020, she completed her habilitation titled, and the translation is mine, Expansions of the Sculptural Analysis and Theories of Current Borderline Phenomena, Non-Human Living Sculpture Since the 60s, Hans Haake and Pierre Huyck. Her research interests include French Baroque sculpture, sculpture in the 20th and 21st centuries, including digital phenomena of the sculptural, studio history, exhibition practice and mediation, as well as art and ecology. Ursula will give insight into her thinking on the shifts in sculpture history and theory in the second half of the 20th century in view of the proclaimed expansion of the medium. The focus of her paper lies on sculpture's relation to technology, or rather the machine, and its impact on our understanding of the body, both human and non-human. Let me quote from her abstract. In 1979, Rosalind Krauss published her influential diagram, Sculpture in the Expanded Field, developing a structural understanding of sculpture beyond material-specific questions, thereby opening a postmodernist or post-medium field of the sculptural. Following the narrative of Sculpture in the Expanded Field, this paper aims to discuss relevant theories of sculpture within historical and contemporary changes, looking at the interconnection between the body and the machine, including phenomena like digital, virtual, and 3D printed sculptures. Dear Ursula, welcome to the screen. We very much look forward to your presentation From Body to Machine, Sculpture in Times of Technological Change. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia, for this kind introduction, and thank you, Franziska and Patricia, for organizing this amazing symposium. I'm very happy to be part of it. Today, hybrid forms of reality determine our daily life. Reality may be related to our own physical space, natural surrounding, or urban surroundings, or to virtual worlds of our digital society. They coexist and overlap in techniques like augmented or mixed reality, and therefore open expanded ways of perception. The gaze of the viewer is absorbed, sometimes even the whole body, in a corporal experience. Unlike classical sculpture, virtual objects are mainly characterized by a visual presence, pixels on the surface of a screen, without sharing the same spatial conditions as its counterpart. However, since the 1950s, 60s, sculpture has undergone a major shift in artistic practice and theory, bringing together different media, techniques, and conceptual approaches. Even if Umberto Boccioni already in 1912 proclaimed a futurist technological vision of sculpture, dissolving the entity of the body and the stable contour. In his technical manifesto of futurist sculpture, he argues for the interconnection between the body and its environment, or the machine, but he still remains on a representative level. I quote, "Yet sculpture, as it has been understood so far by the artists of the last present centuries, is a monstrous anachronism." End of quote. Boccioni here refers to the academic concept of the nude. As is well known, the body, human and non-human, has always been a key subject throughout the history of sculpture. Historically, the theoretic sculpture discourses have been influenced by topoi, such as the myth of Pygmalion or the Paragone, drawing parallels to other art forms. In recent discussions, media-specific features like spatiality, plasticity, temporality have been highlighted using ideas from phenomenological, discourse analytic, image theoretic perspectives. In 1968, Jack Burnham's survey book, Beyond Modern Sculpture, The Effects of Science and Technology on the Sculpture of the Century, connected the history of sculpture with technology, thus moving it away from traditional anthropomorphism. He understood sculpture as a mirror of the current stage of knowledge in biology and technology, with the potential to design life-simulating systems. According to him, the developmental history of sculpture, whereby sculpture culminates in its productive exchange with technological and scientific achievements of the time, must take into consideration positions beyond the conventional canon, such as dolls, automatons, kinetics, cybernetics, and cyborg art, as he calls it. In contrast to Michael Freed's criticism of minimal art as a theoretical, literalist art and its objecthood, Burnham assigned post-formalist sculpture the status of a so-called real-time system in view of its experimental openness, kinetic characteristics, and more lifelike activity. In the context of system theory and cybernetics, one might think of Norbert Wiener's groundbreaking book Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, as well as Artificial Intelligence. Burnham is interested in artistic works whose individual components interact with each other and with their environment, which are self-organizing, data-generating, and information processing in real time. This kind of, I quote, bridge between the external plastic infinite and the internal plastic infinite that the objects never come to an end in themselves, but intersect with infinite combinations, end of quote, was already pronounced by Boccioni theoretically, not realizing it in his own artworks during his short career. According to Burnham, sculptural formalism has been interpreted as a pre-stage for the assembly of machine components and systems in art. Together with kinetic art, he understands modern formalism as incipient mechanization applied to art. I quote, "The machine then becomes the legitimate heir to the sculptural tradition of form creation," end of quote. In 1979, Rosalind Krauss published her influential diagram, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. She develops a structural understanding of sculpture by young, material-specific questions, thereby opening a postmodernist field of the sculptural under a post-medium condition. Following the paradigm of sculpture in the expanded field, my statement aims to briefly introduce a few relevant theories and narratives of sculpture within historical and contemporary changes. I will focus on the interconnection between the body and the machine, including recent phenomena like digital, virtual, and 3D printed sculptures in contemporary art. The predominant narratives of modern sculpture in the 20th century demonstrate the significance of a vitalistic, existentialist discourse field. Carola Guillon's Welker image compositions of landscape and animal photography, juxtaposed against objects by Hans Arp and Constantin Brancusi, underline visually this comparison between artifact and organism in the context of biomorphism. The topos of Pygmalion continues to live on in sculpture, thus evoking liveliness and so-called mimesis of nature. Two main threads have been influential for the increasing entanglement of sculpture and technology. First, the advancing technologization of the everyday life, consisting of intermeshed synthetic systems and materials. Second, the ancient human dream of creating new artificial life, thus shaping a liminal concept of nature and a kind of new biological reality. This is expressed in the search for the imitation of life in the three-dimensional medium of sculpture, e.g. in the Pygmalion topos, but also in the figure of the Deus sculptor or in the Faustian experiment of the homunculus. This focus on life simulation or systems with organic properties leads to the vitalistic tradition in sculpture with its interest for organic life and cyber biology. During the last few decades, one might recognize traces of it still present in bioart or transgenic art. Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, his analogization of the human brain and the machine in its systemic structures, also supports new thinking in how to create intelligent life and a prosthesis like fusion of body and analytical machinery. In this contextual frame, Burnham discusses the inherent fear connected with the term robot, a non-human super artificial intelligence. See, for example, the fictional AI Hell in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey from 1961, and also machine consciousness. In the last chapter of Beyond Modern Sculpture, he introduces different examples of robots in industry, aerospace development, and film production, also looking back to precursors as the writer by Pierre-Jacques Dreux from the 18th century. Mock robots as sculpture is the subtitle of a section in this chapter, which includes here only male artistic positions such as Edoardo Paolozzi, Ernest Truva, Jean-Aubert Ipustegui, and Frank Gallo. The sculptural challenge of mimesis seems to be reloaded. The robot as pensive, twilight figure turns out to become a significant subject, e.g. for Paolozzi. He creates futurist technoid bodies, remaining human-like but still a static entity, cast in bronze or welded in metal, as the artist declared in his manifesto, The Metallization of a Dream in 1963. And we've heard more about it yesterday in the wonderful paper of Alex Kidnick. 1 year later, Herbert Reed published a concise history of modern sculpture. He proclaims the ubiquitous presence of the material metal and steel, which is especially suitable for the traditional medium specificity, which is durability, as a mirror of a new Iron Age, represented in the work of Paolozzi. Similar to Lawrence Alloway, who states an anthropomorphization of the machine in his commentary to Paolozzi's Manifesto, Burnham concludes at the end of the 60s, I quote, "For our generation, much significant anthropomorphic sculpture does not imitate man, but imitates robots trying to become human." End of quote. Even both Alloway and Burnham seem to criticize the anthropomorphization of the machine, which they understand as a result of a lack of technical knowledge by the artist. They assign them a certain human charm. Burnham doubts whether a non-anthropomorphic sculpture exists at all, or can exist at all. Artists like Nicolas Schöffer, Enrique Castro-Cid, James C. Wright, or Nam June Paik are in his focus here, because they all create sculptural, systemic, time-based works featuring interaction and control devices. Also in the 60s, the scientist, science fiction author, and artist Herbert W. Franke sought to expand the boundaries of sculpture towards the virtual space. He asks, I quote, "Could the computer lead us also in new areas of sculpture? A way to find an answer is to ignore the mentioned conditions for physical realization and try to design not realizable 3D forms," end of quote. By using computers, it became possible to simulate material, leaving behind the traditional sculptural paradigm, truth to material, and to enlarge the repertoire of forms and its scalability to create mobile, non-static, partly interactive virtual sculptures. These digital sculptures are no longer tactile in the classic sense, but remain three-dimensional and visible from all sides. His first works are written in Quick Basic and represented on a monitor or on a television screen. I quote, "Because the virtual reality will become increasing meaning in the art of tomorrow, the question of construction with material will become negligible," end of quote. This is why Franke also focuses on virtual exhibitions in the internet, such as his Z Galaxy, that you can see below on the left. His artworks represent a relevant link to the current generation of contemporary artists. Today, one could ask whether new sculptural tools such as AR, VR, mixed reality, e.g. by Marina Abramovic's recent digital personal avatar in the life, AI or 3D printing like Karin Sander's body scan will lose their popularity, and will the works lose their self-reflecting potential once we are more familiar with these technologies? I'm thinking of holograms that have been welcomed by the arts in the 1970s and 80s as a kind of new image production method. Holograms were praised as sculptures of light, and a wedding of sculpture and light as tangible and intangible, as shown in experiments by Simone Forti or Bruce Nauman. The magazine Holosphere and the foundation of the Museum of Holography 1976 in New York are accompanying effects. After a longer break, it seems that holograms reappear in contemporary political art, e.g. in 2017, the hologram by Rudrak's Media Collective, which refers to an absent body. Jack Burnham's claim for creating live simulating real-time systems in sculpture has now been realized in Ian Chang's Emissary Trilogy, a computer-made trilogy of cognitive evolution with various post-human characters and a post-apocalyptic flora and fauna, including different behaviors following an open narrative. These digital species and their artificial bodies have their own life cycle, determined by an AI in a dystopian nature. Taking this art theoretical and artistic background into account, I would like to end with two different artistic positions that could probably be contextualized in the sculpture field of the post-digital age, including references to sculpture history itself. The artist duo Moreshen Alayari and Dani Rook proclaim the new post-humanistic age in their film 3D Additivist Manifesto from 2015. They use the 3D printer as a profound metaphor as technology for channeling creative endeavor through digital processes. 3D printing here embodies the primacy of creative digital technologies. Further, the stimulation, synthesis, and excess of algorithms lead into a new material aesthetics of vibrant matter, interfering with human organisms in an utopian way. I quote, "We call not for passive, dead technologies, but rather for a gradual awakening of matter, the emergency, ultimately, of a new form of life." End of quote. Their manifesto is based on a text collage of quotations by visionaries and theorists, amongst others Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, Braidotti, Bataille, or Stanislav Lem. One met Puccioni and the futurists. The manifesto aims for a cybernetic interconnection of machine and human body, as they say, the fertile union between a man and an analytical engine. Synthetic technology is the new modality of a biological post-human medium, crediting intelligence to all kinds of matter. In the film, one might find sculptural quotations such as Marcel Duchamp's iconic ready-made fountain, which is representative of modern notions of art and authorship, or the Hellenistic torso of the Venus from Milon, a symbol of the traditional aesthetics and figurative sculpture. Departing from linear concepts in history, here, different sculptural objects, industrial artifacts, technological residues, cyber bodies, and animalistic details such as the octopus seemingly coexist in synchronicity. Thus, in image and text, the film is based on the principle of sampling, juxtaposing oppositions and paradoxes. Additivism is derived from additive and activism, and according to the artists, aims to disrupt existing categories, expanding the art project towards an online community, activism, ironic commentary, and revolutionary potential. In another project, Material Speculation ISIS from 2015, Alayari uses the sculptural tool of 3D printing and digital modeling to reconstruct 12 of the destroyed artifacts at Mosul Museum in Iraq by ISIS. Inside of each figurative sculpture, Alayari integrated a flash drive containing textual information about this endangered cultural heritage that she had collected, as well as printable files. Alayari considers these reconstructed sculptures as time capsules, trying to resist the destruction of history and to keep the memories instead for future societies. Within this context, 3D printing serves as a tool with political significance. Content-aware studies, the final example by the artist Igor Kraft, is a multimedia project. It deals with generative and algorithmic methods to reconstruct, reimagine, and rebuild missing fragments of friezes and statues of the late antiquity and the Hellenistic periods. Using a trained algorithm and based on the analysis of custom compiled data sets of thousands of 3D scans and images of other relevant artifacts, Kraft creates 3D printed sculptures and digital models. He raises questions of materiality, site-specificity, time, and authorship of historic monuments throughout art in the post-digital age. Some of the missing fragments are 3D printed in polyamide. Content-aware studies plays with previous strategies, for example in the Renaissance, when artists completed and interpreted Greek and Roman torsos in marble, stone, and drawings, like the Laocoon or the torso of the Belvedere. In some cases, this leads to unexpected misinterpretation of human physiognomy and anatomy glitches that you can see here. Kraft proposes to ask how far machine intelligence will be accepted as a tool that already determines our everyday lives, often unconsciously. Departing from Burnham, his systems aesthetics instead of object aesthetics, and technological approach to reflect the complex relationship between body, sculpture, and machine in art history, these contemporary artists show in different ways how techniques may or already have become dominant in modeling nature and the body. But these techniques are still dependent on human impetus, blurring established boundaries for new interconnections, thus allowing new forms of hybridity, mutations of matter and digital heritage. Unlike the traditional sculptural paradigm, truth to material, these digital monuments and objects are made of simulations, question the flexibility of media-specific categories, and interrogate established concepts of monumentality, scalability, site-specificity, originality, and reproduction, allowing online data files to circulate. So I just wanted to roughly lay out here some aspects of the recent history of sculpture as a starting point, and I'm now very much looking forward to the lecture by Megan Luke. Thank you very much for your attention. Ich can't hear you.
Sorry, I forget to unmute myself regularly. So Ursula, thanks a lot for this presentation. And I think it will be a brilliant connection to what Megan is going to talk about now. And you'll hear precisely the question of the impact of technologies and the question of what the properties of sculpture mean under redefined reproduction technological conditions actually are. So it's my great pleasure to now introduce Megan Luke to our audience. Megan is an associate professor in art history at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. She's a specialist in modern art, architecture, and art writing of the 19th and 20th centuries, with particular interests in art reproduction, early cinema, and theories of the image. Megan is the author of Kurt Schwitter's Space, Image, Exile from 2014, as well as the editor of the comprehensive English translation of Schwitter's theoretical texts, Myself and My Aims, Writing on Art and Criticism 2020, both published by University of Chicago Press. One could argue that with her writing on Schwitter's, Megan started developing her thesis of the seminal role that reproduction technologies play for both sculptural practices and the theoretical engagement with the medium. This thinking also informed her book, Photography and Sculpture, The Art Object in Reproduction, co-edited with Sarah Hamill for Getty Publications in 2017. Her current book project, The Sculptural Surrogate, Reproduction and the Object of History, examines how technologies of facsimile reproduction shaped a modern understanding of sculpture and its claims to represent the past. And we're thrilled that she will share her research from this project for the first time here on a larger scale with us. In her talk, Megan will make the strong argument that throughout modernity, technologies of mass reproduction have, in unprecedented ways, changed how sculpture was both being made and interpreted. Not only did these reproduction technologies affect sculptural production, but also its visualization and thus historicization. I quote from her abstract. This talk will focus on the development of a modern theory of sculpture in Germany in an age of mass reproduction and as a consequence of the accompanying crisis of historicism. In this period, artists and historians dismantled the conception advanced by Lessing and Herder that sculpture was a fully integrated body whose autonomy corresponded to that of the beholding subject. Instead, it became an art that choreographed the viewer's experience of space, uniquely registered the mutability of surface, prompted reflection on the status of its own objecthood, and negotiated the imagined perils of fetishistic attachment. Precisely because the integrity of sculptural form appeared to disintegrate into countless copies, to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, its capacity to reanimate the past in perception intensified. At the stake in this paradox, then as now, is sculpture's capacity to serve as a repository for collective memory and as a vehicle for the democratization of aesthetic experience. Dear Megan, I can't wait to hear your talk, Sculpture in the Age of Mass Reproduction, and I hand over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrizia, for this warm welcome and for the incredibly generous invitation. It's been a real pleasure having conversations with you and Francisca in the lead up to this ambitious and absolutely remarkable event. I am so impressed by how you guys have managed to bring us all together in these most unusual times. And I also want to thank the entire team at the Museum Brandhorst for making this technological mediation possible. And to Ursula Strobele, I cannot wait to have a conversation with you after this. And hopefully we can all reunite in Munich when the exhibition opens. So maybe that's something we can look forward to with our future bodies. Okay, so I will just get started. Terrific. Today, it is possible to store any object as digital data in the cloud, where it waits invisible and intangible until it is printed into synthetic polymers on demand. Photogrammetry software and additive manufacturing techniques promise to resurrect cultural heritage lost to war or violent expropriation. They indulge the enduring fantasy of a history of art without loss. Yet this power comes at the expense of our ability to locate their objects securely in space and time. Against this expanded horizon of reproductive potential, encyclopedic museums must reckon with the legacy locked in their storerooms, as debates about repatriation and the legitimacy of historical monuments erupt with renewed urgency. Shadowing these efforts to repossess the past through material artifacts and their surrogates are unresolved questions inherited from the history of sculpture in modernity. Can the past survive in embodied form at all? And if so, what objects are most capable of enlivening it in the present? Prior to the invention of photography and electrotyping in the late 1830s, modern European art theory primarily identified the medium of sculpture with the fragments of classical antiquity and objects of medieval devotion. As these reproductive technologies were developed and standardized, historical artifacts could be replicated on an industrial scale, miniaturized or enlarged at will, and translated into new materials of unprecedented elasticity, such as rubber or plastic, which were no longer constrained by the archaic techniques of carving or casting. By the turn of the 20th century, this new industry in three-dimensional facsimiles coincided with photography's transformation into a mass medium, fundamentally changing how sculpture was both made and interpreted. As sculpture shape-shifted beyond recognition, it confronted a fantastic array of commodities and the archaeological and ethnographic artifacts extracted through massive expeditions promoting imperial ambition and power. The dispersal of sculptural monuments across photographic archives, cast repositories, and public museums was indispensable for the transformation of aesthetic criticism into the first historical studies of world art. Artists and historians steadily dismantled the Enlightenment conception of sculpture, as advanced by Lessing and Herder, which held it to be a fully integrated body whose autonomy corresponded to that of the beholding subject. Instead, in the age of mass reproducibility, sculpture became a different kind of theoretical object, one that came to choreograph the viewer's experience of space, uniquely register the mutability of surface, prompt reflection on the status of its own objecthood, and negotiate the imagined perils of fetishistic attachment. Although modern sculptors embrace new materials and industrial processes, contemporary theorists regularly disavowed the debt their changing terminology had to real technologies. In order for sculpture to register as material evidence of the workings of a specifically human consciousness, rather than the result of machine automation, they felt compelled to insist on its presence and immediacy, and by analogy, the beholder's empathic projection and self-knowledge. For Walter Benjamin, surveying the consequences in the mid-1930s, the verdict was clear. Quote, "In the age of the montaged artwork, the decline of sculpture is inevitable," end quote. In his account, film was the paradigm of the montaged work of art. As a medium capable of endless editing and reconfiguration, it resisted a conception of value as timeless and unchanging. The foil to the film was, quote, the form least capable of improvement, namely sculpture, whose products are literally all of a piece, end quote. The antithesis Benjamin established between the ancient Greek statue, quote, created at a single stroke, end quote, and Charlie Chaplin's cutting room floor for A Woman of Paris was predicated upon two fully alienated models of temporal transmission and experience. The unique event of a single sculptural body could only communicate eternal values across centuries through a chain of potential substitutions with other works of the same type. When we behold such a work, we enter its time, a time of myth rather than history. The reproductive, iterative basis of a given film, by contrast, encouraged temporary constellations of meaning guided by a particular subjectivity thoroughly conditioned by the specific means of production. If, as Benjamin claimed, the auratic here and now of the singular image recedes in a reproductive age, it resurfaces in the defeat of eternity by a conception of history as an irreversible, in the victory of filmic succession over sculptural simultaneity. However, by the time Benjamin penned these reflections on the work of art and the age of its technological reproducibility, sculpture had long ceased to be a cohesive and closed figure or a monolith of uniform materiality. As the sculptor Adolf Hildebrand was the first to theorize, sculpture constituted space in tandem with the beholder. The space of this encounter could no longer remain a virtual, independent, or homogeneous totality into which we imaginatively project ourselves, extrapolating memories of tactile sensation from optical experience. Rather, it was a real space that the sculpture shares, even creates, with other bodies. In his 1893 treatise on the problem of form in visual art, Hildebrand argued that the coherency of this space was entirely dependent upon the relative position of the beholder to the work. Form ensured this relationship was no accident, anchoring our perception to free it from its restless and agonizing movement in the void. Paradoxically, it was this orientation to the beholding body that smuggled the claim of cult value into an age that had, by any other measure, appeared to have eradicated the need for it. The facsimile industry of Hildebrand's day had destabilized collective faith in tangible form as a reliable vessel for past experience, capable of conveying its cargo securely into the present so that it may be reanimated in perception. Benjamin elided this commercial reality to insist on sculpture as a theoretical construct that was deliberately archaic and consequently non-simultaneous with the new episteme engendered by mass technologies. Indeed, it was an entity that remained trapped in a cyclical temporality of predestined rise and fall, maturity, and, as he put it, decline. In short, just as sculpture appeared to disintegrate into countless copies, to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time, partisans for modern art worked to condense past experience into concrete form and to preserve it in the face of accelerating oblivion. The same photoelectric technologies that had reinvented sculptural production in modernity newly visualized and reconfigured its history for expanding audiences. This coincidence has remained unexamined in the history of art and anthropology, yet it has radical consequences for our understanding of how sculpture gives shape to time. As Benjamin's theoretical fiction of sculpture's eternal fixity betrays, it was a medium that increasingly came to signify an atavistic impulse at the heart of a disenchanted modernity. Indeed, precisely because the integrity of sculptural form appeared to dissolve through mechanical reproduction and synthetic materials, its capacity to reanimate the past in perception intensified. In what follows, I shall explore this paradox in various episodes within the German art and intellectual context of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, touching first on the relationship between material and style, the development of serial sculpture, and the crisis of the monument. I will end by examining the apparition of sculptural surrogates in the museum and the photo archive in the years of economic and political crisis at the end of the 1920s. At stake in this history, then as now, is sculpture's enduring function as a material repository for collective memory and as a vehicle for the democratization of aesthetic experience. In the first volume of his magnum opus, Style in the Technical and Tectonic Arts, published in 1860, Gottfried Semper recounted his perplexed confrontation with a wholly new material, vulcanized rubber, at the Great Exhibition in London and again at the Exposition Universelle in Paris. Harvested in Brazil and the East Indies and processed in the United States and England, this, quote, factotum of industry could be transformed into a mind-boggling assortment of objects, from clothing to high-relief sculpture, tools to knickknacks. Yet its bewildering powers of mimesis and metamorphosis posed a threat to Semper's entire theoretical enterprise. He believed that any fabricated object ought to express the specific properties of the material and technical processes deployed to give it form. Over time, however, this expression inevitably takes on a symbolic dimension. It becomes into motifs that can migrate away from the materials that had originally motivated them, to be applied to other materials by other means. Style regulated the transfer of these enduring motifs so that they could continue to serve as a memory bank of images, traces of how humans have perpetually sought to give order to and find their place within the cosmos. The primary motif in Semper's system is Bekleidung, dressing, or rather enclosure, which traveled from textiles to latticework and ultimately the polychrome stucco of ancient Greek architectural ornament. Surface was, therefore, the privileged site where the significance of a given form for spatial enclosure was legible and ultimately instructive. Now, within such a system, rubber is a material without history. Its paradoxical identity as something, quote, almost immutable and at the same time absolutely flexible, end quote, fueled Semper's anxiety about the fate of correct protocols of design in the industrial age when, quote, we can now cut the hardest stones with machines as if it were cheese or bread, end quote. Much like plastic in the century to come, rubber was the perfect material to match this modern technological omnipotence. It was a material that was so accommodating to any form that it threatened to lose itself completely within the mimetic operations it was enlisted to serve. It offered no resistance to its application, brought no specificity to the structure of the historical transfer of form over time and across cultures. Semper's conclusions about rubber remain brief and provisional, yet the concerns he voiced about its stylistic promiscuity and formal elasticity reverberate in the subsequent history of serialized sculptural production. Indeed, we may recognize this legacy most clearly in Semper's efforts to align rubber with metal in terms of their shared receptivity, not just to techniques of hammering, molding, and polishing, but to the novel technology of galvanoplastic, which replaced the archaic fire of the foundry with electrical current for processes of casting and gilding. For Semper, the malleability of metal had an effect on style, quote, but not in the way that was assumed. In other words, not by being visible, end quote. His ideal of metal construction was invisible architecture, scaffolding that performed a structural but not a symbolic function. Similarly, the ideal of metal work was weaponry, which was, quote, dominated by directional unity, end quote. An exquisite turn of phrase that alerts us to the ways such an object dispels its mass into vectors of force. The theorist of style had inherited the dream of the modern sculptor, who longed for a bronze cast that would require no chasing. That is, the less visible the evidence that metal had been worked, the more perfect the metal work. At its most fully realized, metal work in modernity signified an object's transparency to systems of reduplication and inscription, and its receptivity to the transactional mechanisms of commerce and conflict. In Jacques Decasso's foundational account, serial sculpture was not a matter of, quote, uniformity or simple multiplication, but rather a dynamic repetition, end quote. The series allows for variations in the scale, material, even form of a given motif. Serial sculpture is not solely an artifact of casting technology, but of the state apparatus for national monuments and the private enterprise of the metallurgical industry. Plaster, terracotta, and imitation stone and ivory were certainly all popular materials for serial sculpture, yet it was specifically the investment of large reserves of capital required by metalwork that drove the market for these objects in the first place. In the 1830s, the introduction of reduction machines, photography, electrotyping, together with the application of copyright law to works of art, prompted a fundamental shift in the relationship between a sculpture and its copy. The original was no longer understood to be a parent, generating a limited edition of offspring endowed with its aura, but a prototype that only came into existence in the wake of the series, whether through a contractual agreement between artist and foundry or in a court of law settling charges of counterfeiting. If the private market for small-scale reductions was found wanting, a proposal for an ambitious public work in bronze exhibited at the Salon would likely remain little more than a half-baked proposition in plaster. Sculpture became an object of speculation, what Decasso calls, quote, sculpture without a date or without a title, sculpture even without a sculptor, end quote. In Germany, serial sculpture was a direct consequence of the Prussian war machine. The string of military victories over Denmark, Austria, and France fueled a boom in public monuments, whose crowning glory remains one of the most recognizable icons of the capital to this day, the Victoria striding atop the Siegessäule, cast by the Gladenbeck foundry from the metal of captured cannons. The seemingly endless parade of state commissions was matched by an equally voracious appetite for Reichsplastik, the portrait busts of the Kaiser or Bismarck that filled middle-class parlors in the wake of national unification. And I'm not sure what happened with the slides on the left, but you should be able to have seen these little busts of the Kaiser and Bismarck and advertisements for them together with stereoscopic photographs. It's a fascinating kind of combination of advertising for different technological reproductions. But in any case, to be sure, this kind of patriotic kitsch, along with reductions of antique statuary, had long been the stock in trade of plaster foundries, which had served to reinforce a culture of collective commemoration firmly anchored in urban space. Yet in the last decades of the 19th century, this relationship too began to reverse. For the first time, the public monument itself ceased to be a unique work bound to a specific site, and instead became an object to be duplicated and distributed to other town centers. A statue in bronze would signify the privilege a particular place held for the historical personage or event represented, whereas cheaper, full-scale replicas in zinc, for example, could be installed in communities with a secondary claim to importance. The truth or authenticity of the monument therefore came to depend on the relative value of the material deployed, rather than its fixity in space and time. At the turn of the century, serial sculpture was increasingly shadowed by critical efforts to distinguish between real, echt, and artificial, unecht, materials, positions we see exemplified by the revival of the ancient lost wax technique and the rise of electrotyping, respectively. For example, after Gladenbeck became a joint stock company, it invested heavily in improving the lost wax process, trading on its reputation as a foundry for monumental casting, to specialize in small-scale sculptures vaunted for their technological perfection. The use of reduction machines was as much a selling point for these Ladenbronzen, or shop bronzes, as their clean and flawless surfaces, artifacts of the utmost modernity with all the authority of ancient metalwork. In 1903, Gladden entered into a prestige contract with Max Klinger to license his sculpture in the wake of the international sensation provoked by his Beethoven monument at the Vienna Secession. The Beethoven was relentlessly publicized as a triumph of the artist's obsessive quest for real material. A luxurious concoction of bronze, ivory, gold leaf, amber, semi-precious stones, alabaster, and naturally colored marbles, it is an assemblage of singular parts, each made to measure and fitted together like an elaborate puzzle. Klinger had traveled to quarries in Greece, the Pyrenees, and Tyrol to select the various stones himself. And he had lived for many months in Paris to oversee work at the celebrated Pierre Bingen foundry, one of the only enterprises in Europe that could employ the lost wax technique to cast the mammoth bronze throne as a single piece. The Beethoven was a thoroughly montaged work of art, but when apprehended as a coherent body, it was hardly open to endless improvement, as Benjamin would later theorize. This was the role that fell to the Gladenbeck bronzes to fulfill, which were intended to circulate and be seen in much the same way as the numerous photographic books and portfolios published to celebrate the master's direct involvement with every detail of his craft. That is, just as Klinger insisted on the authority of his touch and the integrity of his work, he set in motion an irreversible extension of the sculptural event into an array of technological objects and images. For critics at the time, the electrotype appeared to occupy the opposite end of the spectrum to the bronzes fabricated through the lost wax process. The Württembergische Metallwarenfabrik, or the WMF, a leading tableware manufacturer, established a subsidiary branch to electrotype sculpture, marketing these objects as cheaper alternatives to the real bronzes offered by firms like Gladenbeck. Known for its cutlery and later its electric coffee machines, the WMF sought to advertise the quality of its art reproductions by fabricating grand, unique showpieces. The same year Gladenbeck issued its Klinger bronzes, the WMF initiated plans for the largest electrotype it had ever attempted, a full-scale replica of Andreas Schlüter's equestrian statue of Elector Friedrich Wilhelm, which dominates the foyer of the Bode Museum in Berlin to this day. If Klinger's Beethoven established a model for modern sculpture that found its fullest realization in the photographic series, the WMF demonstrated how thoroughly subordinated to this logic the historical monument too had become. Ultimately, it was the cemetery, rather than the museum, that proved to be the true home for the serial sculpture produced by the WMF. And like so many of the Gladenbeck monuments of the Gründerzeit, these abundant grave markers would be routinely sacrificed to the armament production feeding the total wars of the 20th century. Of course, electrotyping was popular not just for the fabrication of monuments to private memory, but also for the production of letterpress plates and clichés for photographic reproduction in books. As a single platform for the transmission of both an object and its image, we may therefore recognize a compelling precedent for the technologies of digital rendering and stereolithography prevalent for serial sculpture in our digital age. In the 1880s, Charles Blanc could still enthuse that, quote, electrotyping is like the photography of sculpture. It gives us not only the appearance of relief sculpture, it also shows us reality with a perfect faithfulness. It is not a translation on paper of the effect of metal, it is the imprint in metal of metal itself, end quote. But after the First World War, it had become impossible to accept this rhetoric of substitution and the truth to material it implied. Perhaps no object better encapsulates this shift than the painted plaster Beethoven Mask submitted to the 1920 Berlin Dada Messe by Otto Schmalhausen, an exhibition that coincided with Klinger's death. Taking the same life cast of the composer that had served as Klinger's model, Schmalhausen created an ironic portrait of the deposed Kaiser, which Sherwin-Simmons has argued has more than a passing resemblance to Charlie Chaplin. Yet to my mind, this object functions above all as a kind of historical commentary on the recent transformation of the medium of sculpture in a technological age. In setting himself, quote, the task of recalling the heroes of the past to us, end quote, what Schmalhausen ultimately revealed was a physiognomy that had ceased to serve as a legible guarantee for a fixed character or identity. Klinger's own incessant recycling of this face across print, painting, and sculpture had made it a floating signifier. And through its photographic reproduction and Dada reworking, it appeared capable of being readily transplanted and grafted onto any body at will. Transformed into a decorative talisman for the bourgeois home and the public square alike, sculpture had become the conflicted object it remains today, one that appears especially vulnerable to the volatility and distortions of mass reproduction, and yet whose corporeality still offers a powerful antidote to ideologies of technological progress and the total rationalization of life. In this connection, it is instructive to consider the vehemence with which Max Sauerland, director of the Museum für Kunst und Gewerbe in Hamburg, attacked the electrotypes of the Bamberg Reiter, marketed by the WMF in 1929. As was common for serial sculpture throughout the 19th century, these objects were sold with or without a base, in a full range of arbitrary sizes, as a hollow metal object or a plated plaster cast, in whole or as a bust. Faced with this commercial assault on the body of a monument so central for the modern conception of an authentic German self, Sauerland charged that the sculpture had been, quote, forged, setting off an extensive debate among Germany's leading museum directors and art historians about the legitimacy of art reproduction and its potential threat to public education and civic participation. With this polemical claim, Sauerland was under no illusion that the variously scaled and patinated electrotypes of the Bamberg Reiter could possibly be mistaken for the medieval stone sculpture in the cathedral. Rather, they unhinged form and material to privatize aesthetic experience. This was a development celebrated by the art historian of medieval sculpture, Willem Pinder, one of Sauerland's chief adversaries in the controversy. In a widely cited review of the deluxe color facsimile prints published by the Piper Verlag, Pinder claimed, quote, "It is only a prejudice that denies the fortunate owner of such a reproduction the feeling that he owns the original itself," end quote. Sauerland rejected the conceit that mass reproduction and the patterns of consumption it stimulated brought the heritage of the past within the reach of the masses. On the contrary, the facsimile was the handmaid to a compensatory ersatz culture that indelibly secured hierarchies of class and education and remained utterly confined to its moment. As Sauerland saw it, the withdrawal of sculpture from public life in, quote, the age of synthetic gemstones, of vitamin-free canned vegetables, of nicotine-free cigars, and of decaffeinated coffee, end quote, demanded the sensitivity to the work of art as materialized form, an organic substance that matures, ages, and develops beyond the moment of its conception. Sculpture ceased to embody value or historicity and was simply a temporary vessel for the endless movements of circulation and exchange. This was the legacy of metalwork in modernity that Zemper had anxiously anticipated. The horseman in the Bamberg Cathedral would no longer serve as a fixed guarantee of symbolic value, as he had in 1920, when his physiognomy appeared on the first 100-mark banknote issued in the newly established Weimar Republic. If anything, the reproduction of this national icon through electrotypy now fully subsumed the monument itself under the unstable sign of paper money, a reversal that, in 1929, could only appear as a traumatic repetition of the hyperinflation in the midst of an unfolding global economic crisis. And I'll just skip over a few slides in the interest of some time. So these intense debates over art reproduction that transpired in the art press centered on the public display of dead plaster casts, electrotyped replicas, and high-quality color facsimile prints. These controversies touched on others pertaining to memorials for the war dead and the place of living contemporary art in mass visual culture in the museum. At issue in each case was uncertainty over where precisely history inhered within art, in its material specificity and survival, or in the felt experience of audiences seeking to commune with the past. Sauerland understood that this uncertainty rested on the fact that mechanical copies did not deviate from originals in any uniform or predictable way. Reflecting on the difficulties presented by reproductive photography, for example, he wrote, quote, "Every photograph contains an element of an epochal style, or Zeitstil, and like a bad restorer who is in the habit of restoring a painting in the style of a particular master, so too can the work of art be photographed in the style of a particular epoch, indeed a particular master. Thus, unconsciously, but probably also consciously, we are confronted by the continual offense of interpretive pictorial documents of the most dubious value. We have experienced the Naumburg donors photographed as if they were choristers from Tannhäuser, and the Bamberger Reiter as if he were Lohengrin," end quote. In other words, the photography of sculpture gives a specific form to what Pinder, in his best-selling book, The Problem of Generation, termed the Ungleichzeitigkeit des Gleichzeitigen, or the non-simultaneity of the simultaneous. And indeed, the offending photographs mentioned here refer back to the two wildly popular photo books that Pinder had published with the photographer Walter Hege. Pinder argued that Hege's dramatic photographic series compensated for the lack of sculptural corporeality and tactility in any single image. Views that are not intended to be definitive can be especially instructive. They can give us the same proximity to an artwork that their original creator had when he made it. Even painterly reproductions can impart something important, possibilities of form which the artist himself could not imagine, and which nevertheless are unconscious germs for the conscious possibilities of the future. A unity like the Bamberg Cathedral is simultaneously a past becoming, ein vergangenes Werden, and a present actuality in the state of becoming, eine gewordene Gegebenheit. Our book gives expression to this double character, since the plates correspond to a present experiential sequence, while the text and its illustrations correspond to the temporal sequence of history, end quote. So through Hege's deft manipulation of lighting, framing, and layout, the Bamberg photo book offers numerous surrogates for sculptural expression, which in turn reinforce Pinder's anthropomorphic description of the cathedral and the case he makes in his text for its significance for then present-day German identity. These images offer the reader-beholder a tour of the cathedral's interior, giving filmic continuity to the imagined movement of the body through space. This model reaches its climax with his treatment of the Bamberg Reiter, where the shifting perspectives belong to a viewer no longer constrained by gravity, one who is capable of indulging in ever more proximate close-ups of empathic identification. Indeed, these images, Hege wrote, are intended to enrich the beholder and to show how manifold in expression those works are that the great masters of the past have left behind for us, end quote. In the instant of photographic registration, the time of the medieval sculpture coincides with the time of modernity. Reproductive photography was incapable of relating discontinuous phenomena in a consistent relation to each other in order to form a coherent cultural picture and a chronological sequence. The time to which this historical image belongs remained inescapably the time of the mediating technology itself, a reproductive, deceptively mimetic age. It was an age, to recall Willem Voringer's definition of empathy, that transforms everything into, quote, objectified self-enjoyment, end quote. Okay, I'm clicking for the next slide. Wolfie, do you mind advancing it one? Thank you. The artifacts of the medieval past are thereby transformed into a heritage that offers a homecoming to those whom Ernst Bloch famously described as, quote, Saxons without forests, in his own account of non-simultaneity in the age of Sachlichkeit. Quote, if the swastika crusader wants to be the chosen people, Bloch wrote in 1929, he must slander the original today and exterminate it in order to be chosen himself, to have any race at all, end quote. Bloch understood that such efforts to overcome the panic of feeling oneself to be out of time thrive on Jewish proximity and imagine negativity that can be instrumentalized to mask anxieties about authenticity and drive a fundamentally reproductive dynamic of interchange between copy and original. Certainly, Hege's photo books owed their widespread appeal to the way they harnessed that dynamic to mine the past in search of what Pinder had called the conscious possibilities of the future, and to forge an identity through identification. My final example from this little history of sculpture in the age of mass reproduction turns to another project that manipulated photography to register the body and asks us to consider it in light of sculpture's hold on the past. Next slide, please, Wolfie. Thank you. In a radio lecture from 1931, August Zander described the guiding principle for his photographic archive of social types century as follows, quote, because the individual person does not make the history of his time, but rather molds the expression of his time and expresses its fundamental beliefs, it is possible to grasp a physiognomic time image of an entire generation, and by means of physiognomy, to make that image speak in the photograph, end quote. The word Zander used to describe the way an individual face registers historical time and gives it a particular expression is prägen, to impress, to emboss, or as I have put it here, to mold. The ability of the face to condense and fix the movement of history into an image, what he calls the time image or Zeitbild, recalls a sculptural technique, and a specifically reproductive one at that. History is not written on the face, it is cast. Next slide, please. Zander's understanding of the face of his time as a peculiarly sculptural one was shaped above all by his friend, the painter Franz Wilhelm Seiwert. In the pages of A bis Z, the monthly broadsheet published by the Cologne Progressives between 1929 and 33, reproductions of paintings, drawings, and film stills circulated as supplemental illustrations, whereas photographs of sculpture made specifically visual arguments. Seiwert was responsible for these photo sequences, which he used to advance claims about the morphology of history and the historical development of form. The first of these contributions traced the dialectical development of art, as he put it, through a series of 3 photographic details framing faces carved in stone. Next slide, please. For Seiwert, each face not only expressed the Kunstwollen of a particular age, but specifically indexed a historical moment of economic upheaval and consequently cultural revolution. From the first sculpture to the second, he recognized the transition from what he called an absolute to a literary form of sculptural expression. As stasis gave way to flux, these forms registered the dispersal of collective consciousness into individual isolation, one that was nevertheless still embedded in the church. In his argument, the third sculpture stands for the dialectical sublimation of these formal and social antitheses and the triumph of a Renaissance worldview for which man is the measure of all things. Now, here it is not necessary to unpack how Seiwert based his understanding of these social ruptures in specific visual details. Rather, I want to stress his overall claim namely that these faces are individual examples of exceptional plastic imagination and expressive force. Yet they also represent, quote, the formative powers of their time, end quote. The expression Seivert used to describe how sculpture represents the forces of historical change is umreißen im Schlaglicht, to outline or contour something in the glare of a concentrated beam of light. That is, he enlisted a specifically photographic metaphor to describe how sculpture fixes and embodies the collective expression of the past. Seivert concluded his text with the claim that he and his readers were in the midst of a new world historical turning point. If the Renaissance worldview, quote, restricted the world, end quote, the age of industry and electricity now, quote, distributes the earth's possessions, end quote. With the dawn of a new collectivity, the time had come for sculpture to abandon its dependency on narrative and concentrate on its means of shaping space. But while he invoked the names of contemporary artists like Otto Freundlich and Konstantin Brancusi in this connection, Seivert did not actually include examples of their work in his visual timeline. In this history, the face of the sculpture of his time remains invisible. Next slide, please. Seivert continued this line of thought a few months later in a brief text dedicated to, quote, extensive and intensive sculpture, a Wolflinian dichotomy that deliberately calls to mind the competing theories of extramission and intromission in visual perception. Here, the pictorial sequence does not visualize a historical progression, but instead presents two stylistic alternatives. Taken together, the Gothic at left and the Baroque ornament second from the right give the timeless expression of universal feminine and masculine principles, which resurface in the sculpture of Freundlich and Brancusi, respectively, so says Seivert. Once he stressed the dialectic of the development of form. In each contemporary example, he concluded, it was possible, quote, to comprehend the principle of its polar opposite, the end and the beginning of a movement, here as there, end quote. Next slide, please. There is a tension that runs between Seivert's visual narratives, between his conviction that every era has a legible physiognomy and his recognition that identity is perpetually destabilized in the dialectical movement of consciousness as it works to overcome difference to become something other to itself. Sculpture will only be the face of our time once that time has passed into history. This, after all, is the insight that gives monuments their power. Yet Seivert lies his argument and points to the inescapable crisis of the monument in interwar Germany. While his history may be written on a foundation of stone relics, it is shown through a kind of modern phantasmagoria, apparitions that find their equivalents in the film strip and the art historical slide comparison. In this image world, sculpture is a structuring absence. Like the salaried employees so vividly described by Siegfried Krakauer in his sociological portrait of that nebulous class, it was an art that was, quote, spiritually homeless and inadequate to the demands of the state and the utopian ideals of the avant-garde alike. Next slide, please. The fate of Freundlich's sculpture in the Nazi state would prove emblematic on this score. The head that Seivert had illustrated and the large head confiscated from the Kunsthalle Hamburg were both exhibited in the defamatory Entartete Kunst exhibition. The large head was quickly misappropriated for the cover of the catalog and other promotional materials for the run of the tour. Sublimated into a photographic image, Freundlich's self-consciously archaic and primitivizing sculptural language became the physiognomy of the new man, an image forced to summon, again through negation, the phantasm of Aryan identity. Next slide, please. What if we were to understand physiognomy to be a mask rather than a legible script that could be learned and decoded? What if such an image occluded history in the very act of giving it concrete form? Zonder's exchange with Seivert was formative for his conception of a vast photographic training atlas, as Benjamin memorably described the selection published as Antlitz der Zeit, or Face of Our Time. Nevertheless, his claim that, quote, the individual person does not make the history of his time, but rather molds the expression of his time, suggests that he resisted his friend's desire to read history as a sequence of articulate forms, liberated from material constraint. The very last face in Zonder's atlas, in the portfolio Idiots, the Sick, the Insane, and Matter, once belonged to his son Erich, who perished in a camp for political prisoners in 1944. But the face is no longer flesh, and what the portrait shows instead is the death mask made by another of the progressives, the young sculptor Hans Schmitz. The mask here is both a sculpture and a copy, a cast impression twice over. To embody history, a face had to hide as much as it could show, and only in that recognition could the sculptural monument be reimagined for our time. Thank you very much.
Megan, Ursula, thank you both for your brilliant presentations. And I think there will be a lot to discuss, actually. And I would like to hand over first to Megan and Ursula for a conversation between the two of you, so you can start ruminating on some of the notions that I think are both present in your talks. After that, I would bring questions and I would ask our Zoom participants to join in. And we already have a few questions from the chat, so I guess it's going to be a lively conversation. But for the next 10 to 15 minutes, as long as you want to take it, Megan and Ursula, the screen is yours, please.
And maybe, I'm happy for us to start the conversation, but opening up to questions is absolutely fine with me too, Ursula. So,
Thank you, Megan, for your wonderful paper. I was thrilled how you elaborated this development of sculpture in times of technological reproduction, and how you connected the loss of the aura in the sense of Benjamin and the accompanying involvement of new materials such as rubber with its literal elasticity, flexibility, and adaptability as a key term for modernity, one could say, with the construction of history in the 20th century. So I was wondering if this anxiety to lose sculpture as a medium of unique entity, which means also its wholeness, could be understood as a mirror of the fragments, ruptures, and cracks inscribed in the linear concept of history. So I really found this interesting, using this new material also as a sign of a certain time.
Yeah, I think, and my answer to this question, or just my reflections on this comment, really link up with a thought that I had listening to your presentation, Ursula, about how this very modernist idea of truth to material is really an exception rather than a rule to the whole long history of sculpture, that in a sense I was trying to imagine at what moment was sculpture truly ever conceived to be a whole body, not a body that wasn't constantly being subjected to rebuilding, renovation, replacement, substitutions, falling apart, fragmentation. I feel as if certainly in the pre-modern and early modern eras, there's a certain comfort. They don't have quite the same anxiety that the moderns do, that the sculptural body is somehow perpetually on the edge of disarray, and that rather the whole subject is less the sculptural object and more the beholding subject, right? This idea of the autonomous beholder, and that relationship of a beholder perhaps gaining certainty or comfort or affirmation of one's autonomy in kind of perceiving a sculpture is, to me, as a hallmark of the modern relationship to sculpture, and that desire to, in a sense, assert or affirm one's freedom in a very Enlightenment sense in this relationship to sculpture, then starts to really affect how material gets theorized, and even the sculptural body itself as a kind of surrogate for an integrated, coherent subject. And one of the things that I find fascinating is in modern sculpture theory, there's a kind of unspoken anxiety. There's this real desire to keep at bay the perpetual threat of disintegration in time, aka, our immersion in history, to assert new totalities, autonomy, wholeness, and freedom. And so these Enlightenment ideals of the beholding subject really don't go away. They actually make these texts written in the 19th and 20th centuries fraught and fascinating, right? They become almost you have to read between the lines to find in modern sculpture theory an understanding of sculpture as a fundamentally reproduced and synthetic object. Very rarely, I keep searching for some sort of modern sculpture theory in, say, the late from 1890 to around 1930, that would actually foreground sculpture's reproducibility in all sorts of new materials and technologies. And I don't find it directly stated. I see it disavowed. And that's a different kind of trace in the theoretical imagination. So that's something that I'm really trying to work through with this project. But yeah, the truth to material, I feel, is something that dominates, I think, especially given the post-World War II, the moment that this exhibition is covering, truth to material looms large in the sculptural theoretical imagination. But seen in a longer history, even of modernity, it is an exception that I think betrays a certain anxiety, a theoretical anxiety, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. You're totally right. I guess it's a more complex kind of a relationship, and maybe this also concerns the surface, as you said, as a site of significance. And I was wondering if, with these new technologies of reproducing sculptures, what's about this another old paradigm of the la touche, of the touch of the artist's hand of the material, which was usually the moment when the genius, so-called, imprints his ideas onto the material. So, as you said, the sculptors were really looking forward to include these new techniques. I was wondering if there was a post production treatment of the surface also sometimes necessary or possible, similar like a bronze cast, or was this different with the for example, the Bamberg writer you mentioned with these examples, so with the electrotyped object? I'm not too familiar with this technique, so I'm very curious to learn more about it.
Yeah, certainly the electrotypes would need some post-production, especially if they were going to be showcased as kind of advertisements for the film. So this dream of a sculpture that doesn't need, kind of Sizilierung, or this chasing, this kind of filing down afterwards, is not fully realized by electrotype any more than it is by sinter lasering, laser techniques by contemporary sculptors today, or stereolithography. I showed the Oliver Larrick 3D print of the Beethoven by Klinger, and there he deliberately shows how the seams are put together, that this idea of I guess you could say, the imperfections of the technology is something that I think he really wants to showcase, because there's this rhetoric of hyper perfection, I think, in the digital age, that everything, all bumps and wrinkles have been smoothed out. And in fact, that's a lie. It was a lie in the 19th century. It was a lie in the 20th century. It's a lie now, right? These things are insistently produced, and they are material, and there, this, what does perfection, or what does the perfect surface look like, is also a really fascinating one, and particularly for our current moment, when we think, I was thinking of that additive manifesto that you showed, Ursula, that video where all these sort of sculptural renderings are floating in a kind of, post-climate catastrophe world of over-flooded oceans or something like this. Like, I think what we have in this present moment is a real tension between this dream of bodily perfection, or even a release from the body and its aging in these digital virtual environments, and the real threat of the material biting back in the climate age. I think that's something that is perhaps really fascinating, and perhaps will be elaborated as the conference goes on. But yes, with electrotyping, you did have to do some post-production. But what's fascinating, especially with the Klinger example, like the Klinger example in these just books and books and books. This thing was photographed at every stage of its process, even all the intermediate objects that would have been lost, like the wax model for the bronze throne of the Beethoven. It is photographed to show how the lost wax technique would even preserve Klinger's fingerprints. So the reproduction of the object is somehow preserving the touch of the master. And at the same time, as I hope to have shown, all these copies and the splintering of the sculptural body into photographs and facsimiles and replicas make this idea of touch really tenuous, right? It's not exactly possible. So I found that fascinating, that on the one hand, the lost wax technique was revived precisely to give absolutely smooth and almost flawless a surface as was possible. And yet it was also valued for the ways in which it could suggest the, messy, touch of the artist's process.
Yeah, you really showed us an amazing material. I was really impressed by this. And I also liked your notion of the the ancient original now becoming a prototype that needs the series. So it needs the copies, which are not really copies, but as you said, dynamic repetitions, right? So I really like this new understanding of originality, which maybe also is expressed in some of the examples I showed, when you just have files that you can download on your personally, which maybe is not really, but somehow a kind of democratic process as well, because it's more this kind of availability. In the early stages, this could maybe be an equivalent with the Bamberger Reiter, that were like these little sculptures that were present in the bourgeois houses. So I really think it's an interesting question, which is also connected to the scalability, to size, no? Because it's more easy to transport these little figures. So the infrastructures themselves are different, right? I mean, still today, an exhibition of sculpture is way more difficult to handle than, for example, painting sometimes. But, so I really like this idea of distribution of presence within this kind of reproduction sculptured object. Yeah. So maybe there would be also a different audience, because they would more be available to become part of a kind of, as you said, decorative talisman, right? So the whole status of kind of an autonomous object changes.
Yeah, although also there's a kind of ideology of democratization, right? Like the more copies we have, we think, oh, more people have access to the work. And that was something that I thought Sauerland, who is a director of one of the most important collections of industrial art and decorative art in Germany, in Hamburg. And he's a well-known quasi-conservative voice in these reproductive debates, because he does believe in material having some sort of erratic spirit, and that, we need to be seeing real objects as originals as they age. But he does make, I think, a powerful point. Does mass reproduction really equal democracy or democratic access to objects? It depends on where you think, what you think the object actually is. If the object is just this outline of the vague shape of the Bamberg Reiter, or even just the head of the Reiter, right? Because sometimes these electrotypes are making a bust out of an entire equestrian statue or what have you. If you just think it's this kind of ideal form, somehow divorced from the context of the church and so on and so forth, then sure, that's being brought into people's living rooms. But if the work is a kind of form, material, and contextual complex, then what you're doing is you're selling somebody an object promising, it brings art closer to you, but what you're doing is saying art is really for the people who still travel and who are the experts or whatever, right? Like I think he's really suspicious of this discourse about democratization of mass media. And it's no wonder, given that this is at a time when the very democracy of the Republic is also at stake, right? So sometimes reading these debates about art reproduction in 1929, I'm like, don't you guys have more important things to worry about in 1929 than, you know, whether or not, you know, this is a too perfect reproduction? But then I realize what we are oftentimes dealing with is like metaphors always for something larger, right? That it's fascinating to me that sculpture, especially more than almost any other art, at least in the discourse I've been looking at, becomes such a fraught object for a culture's historical consciousness of itself, that in a crisis or in an economy in free fall, if you don't know what your sculpture is, if you don't know what your monuments are, it just adds to the panic. And I think that's absolutely everywhere to read in these texts, in these debates.
Yeah, but this was fascinating how you mentioned Benjamin and his, if I understood you right, and his opinion to see this dissolution or this dissolution of sculpture through the mechanical technologies as an advantage in sculpture's capacity to remember past, right? So I really liked this tension, if you remember Sauerland.
Yeah.
And also I was wondering if then the context and the site becomes even more important as soon as you have copies everywhere that you can today download or you could buy in past times. Yeah. Then it's even more important, and this is what the photo book was like praised as a special advantage, that you could look, as you said, at the photographs without having the viewer's gravity and without having a certain distance to the work due to the, I don't know, say context in a church or somewhere else. So it's all this kind of oscillating situation, I would say, which is really interesting in concerning the history of sculpture, and which should be maybe be taken more into consideration when we write about sculpture today.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Patricia.
Patricia?
Yes. Hi, here I am joining the two of you again because I have an whole array of questions coming in through the chat. And also, yeah, it's really interesting, unprecedented so far for the symposium. And also I wanted to invite our fellow speakers, so maybe we could also see the Zoom. And I start by asking a question that came to you, Ursula. I'm just taking them in the order that they reached us. This question says, perhaps this is an odd observational question, but I find it interesting how in the talks yesterday and earlier, there were only single or few artist examples in each of them. But when we switch to discussing post-media or technological artwork, sculpture or not, we dramatically and exponentially expand the number of works we discuss within a single discourse. I guess my question is, do you think this is a natural iterative mirroring of the movement towards a faster, more reproducible form of art, an increase in the distribution of art in this period due to the advent of mass audiovisual media and advertising? Or is it more a case of there being more works being produced and a higher number of artists? So this went to you, Ursula. Ursula, we can't hear you. Probably you muted yourself.
I'm sorry. Thank you for the question. Did I understand you right that the question was whether we are talking about more examples in the discussions concerning contemporary art or in art in general than in the paper?
No,
contemporary
in contemporary art, yeah, and whether that is related to the more reproducible form of art, or if it's a case of there being more works being produced and a higher number of artists. So what the relation between the visibility and the amount of artists producing work is.
Yeah, maybe it's both, I would say, because as we know, the reproduction of works, of artworks in general, through social media, catalogs, journals, newspapers, is more and more important today for artists. So I guess sometimes we even look more at the reproduction, at the image, at the photograph of the work, than having seen it in original, especially during pandemic times. And I would say that maybe this also helps to see more works. And I also think that more artists produce works today than maybe in earlier days. But this is a kind of question that I can't really answer due to I don't know the exact. Or it's different to compare. But I would say that through the new communication techniques, of course, it's for us. It's more easy to know artists from all over the world. So maybe then we know more works, we discuss more works. And so this is also a question of accessibility, and maybe I guess it was a way more difficult than in times that Megan talked about, if we think of the magazine or the photo books. So it was really a kind of a more rare opportunity to see these different sculptures than today. I hope that answers this question.
I think it does, and I think it will be curious to see what we would say in 100 years from now, and the question how the material carriers of the plethora of images that we're witnessing of art will actually have survived. Megan, there's a question to you. It seems to me that there is a tendency to mystify computer-aided production, to fluff up the language in a way to appeal to an audience mystified by computers. I think this might unfortunately be backwards, with generations growing up with access to computers and millions working in the video game and movie CGI businesses every day. I'd asked if it's not possible to demystify the computer and move figurational phenomenological analysis to the foreground, as we would do with another groundbreaking invention like the drill.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think that the challenge of knowing how one of these technology, for me personally, I'm not as invested as a historian in. I'm not writing a technological history, right? So I am not going deep into the black box of how any of these technologies work. I have a passing familiarity with electrotypy, but there's a lot more that could be said about it as a technological process, just like one could say the same about photogrammetry software, how it gets designed, and so on and so forth. That's a different history than perhaps the one I'm writing. And it's a necessary one, absolutely. It's one that I feel when I encounter it for, say, certain earlier industrial technologies that are also inventions, like finding out how rubber actually gets made, the invention of electrotypy. There's existing technological histories of those processes that I use, and I'm so grateful for. And I'm sure that there's a literature in formation right now that's going to help, as you say, demystify computerized technologies of facsimile reproduction for us. For me personally, what's at stake is actually the ways in which these processes turn into metaphors for a whole array of other human experience. So there is this strange way in which we tend to think of these technological, industrial, perhaps even scientific processes as somehow getting us closer to, as the characters I talk about, the real, right? Something true, something fixed, something that's not constantly threatening to spin out of control. And it's this give and take between a technology that seems to promise some sort of perfection, some sort of reality, some sort of perfect copy, and so forth, and the ways in which these technologies get harnessed to, provide these evocative metaphors of experience. So as a scholar, for me, absolutely, I agree with the question. Shouldn't we be trying to perhaps move away from our kind of awe at computers as just a kind of technological toy, even, to get into approaching its objects with the same kind of phenomenological analysis that we're so attuned to using for a whole range of other seemingly more traditional objects. And I absolutely concur. In fact, that's sort of where my heart is when I'm actually trying to not just analyze the way in which these objects circulate symbolically, but also think about, well, what was it like? I mean, it goes back to Ursula's point about scale. What was it like to use the Bamberger writer as a paperweight? You know, I mean, it's a kind of strange relationship to these things. And oftentimes this is the kind of junk of art history, right? This is like, no art historian is going to sit and like write a whole dissertation on knickknacks or tchotchkes, right? But like, we need to, if we're going to write about sculpture just as much as we might the public monument, because certainly these two things are being experienced in tandem. And so, yes, the point is very well taken. But I do hope that there at least are the technological histories to first do the demystifying for us, and then and then we can continue to develop these phenomenological analyses.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up that matches quite beautifully to this question in the other direction, again to you, Megan. Casting dates back to around 6,000 years ago, and I wonder where you situate or configure this within mass reproduction, especially in the context of additivism and the role craft plays within this.
Yes, I mean, this is actually a point that Benjamin makes when he talks about sculpture as a foil to, say, Charlie Chaplin, where he says, you know, sculpture in theory has always been reproducible. There's always been the technologies, always, right? In sort of, there has been, you know, for there's the capacity to cast or to stamp. You know, these are the two models for making multiples that Benjamin is talking about. But he's really he's trying to diagnose a rupture in terms of what casting does to the object's capacity as this embodiment of history, right? And he is diagnosing a radical shift in the not just the history of sculpture, but I would say it's something I need to work on more closely. I think he's placing it, you know, perhaps not quite explicitly, but he's really pinpointing how the technology of casting comes to be seen less as an ancient art and more as something fundamentally destabilized in the wake of photography and electrotyping. That even this long history that the question is referring to is becoming seen in a very different way in this moment that I've been focusing on. In terms of questions of craft, could you just say that last part again? I don't know if I understood it quite rightly.
Yeah, he asked whether the casting, how you configure it within mass reproduction, especially in the context of additivism and the role craft plays within this.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's something that I'm just starting to play out. I mean, maybe Ursula can speak to that better than I, because she's been perhaps more immersed in some of the more contemporary materials, or this, you know, additivist manifesto, the kind of these technologies. I don't know yet. And it's something that I'm fascinated by, and it's something that I'm just starting to realize. Of course, I'm such a historian in this regard that I tend to see these additive manufacturing technologies always through the light of some sort of prior precedent, and that's kind of fascinating. Like, it's impossible for me to look at Larix 3D prints or the Nefertiti hack that I showed at the beginning of my talk without immediately seeing in it embedded an entire history of not just technology, but again, anxieties about technology and also utopian fantasies about what it can engender.
Yeah, maybe I would, as you were talking about the anxieties, I think that's something that is very pertinent on many levels. And I would ask a question myself in this context. it refers to your description of the proliferation of copies that comes across as something very interesting, a very interesting way to think of sculpture's capacity as a retainer for history and the transcendence of times and spaces, if I understood correctly, the way that you're presenting it is to us. But do you think, asked provocatively, that anything was lost for sculpture by this development? You talked about the fantasy of a history of art without loss. And also I'm relating it to the question or to the observation of this persistence on autonomy in art history, which I think is very much defined by a fear of loss, a loss of agency, of idiosyncrasy, of distinctiveness, you name it. So I think that this relation between the original or the prototype and the copies does affect a very genuine impulse to be special in a way. And I'm wondering if this translation, what this means for sculpture as a medium, and if you detect that despite this capacity that it gains through the reproduction, if there's something that is troubling you also on the other hand.
Yeah, it was fascinating also just hearing, for example, Joe Aplin's talk earlier this morning of thinking it's of course something we all know, that the orientation towards death is also a kind of futurism, even though futurism as a discourse is always so involved with progress and utopianism. But I think hovering this development, as you're saying, that I'm trying to pinpoint, this moment where just as sculpture becomes released from the burden to be a kind of surrogate for the Enlightenment autonomous subject, and it becomes fractured into into mass reproductions, as opposed to, say, this particular highly, this relationship between a small edition of a sculpture and its bronze casting, say, in earlier historical eras, that this development, what happens is just as sculpture becomes an object of modernity, it is called upon to, in a certain sense, be this, to be the bearer of eternal values, as Benjamin puts it. It becomes a medium that is resisting the past. It's sort of resisting this kind of utopianism. And in some cases, one of the things that was completely unconscious as I was putting this talk together was just how many life/death masks were popping up in my slides. I was like, what is this? Like there's history, and it's like a kind of way in which sculpture becomes this almost a memento mori, even more strongly so. It's not the public monument anymore. It is a monument stripped of a kind of triumphant, death is somehow purposeful. Like I'm playing around right now with some ideas about ways in which sculpture is seen as this atavistic medium, as a medium that seems rooted almost intransigently in the past, in the modern era. So even as its own body is becoming modernized, it comes to stand for something that is working in the opposite direction to ideologies of progress. And I don't know, I'm really interested to see the talks that get more into contemporary sculptural practice as the symposium goes on, because I really wonder, why are people making sculpture today? Where is sculpture? What is sculpture? Do we have a need for it anymore? I would suggest that's kind of where I ended, by thinking about the Zonder project of what would a monument even look like today? Certainly monuments are fraught today. Certainly this year has seen just iconoclasm across the board. So sculpture can cause a lot of panic, but I just wonder what the root of that is on even a psychoanalytic level. I haven't quite parsed that, but it's absolutely a problem.
Yes, Ursula, please.
I just wanted to add that it's to Megan's question that it's interesting to see that many contemporary artists refer to the term sculpture by themselves, and this is what interests me in my research. Why do they reflect this seemingly antagonistic category of sculpture? Why do they refer to sculpture, and what are the categories they are interested in? So it's really a kind of tension, but I think sculpture also allows so many different approaches, because since the 60s it has been expanded, it has been pushed its boundaries. So there are, I guess, and maybe it's also this the question of the body, and it's usually a three-dimensional character, which with this very physical presence, which also allows certain kind of more complex relationship between the viewer's body and the object itself, including also questions of perception, which is also transferred to the virtual subject sculptures. I mean, why do contemporary artists use the term sculpture working with virtual reality and augmented reality? They still somehow connect to the discourse of sculpture in history. So, and I'm really interested in how these media-specific questions of sculpture survive throughout times and changing technologies, and what is their interest by the artists themselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm following up with some more questions from the chat that are still coming in. There's a question to Megan. I'm curious about this wonderful discourse on time and the temporalization of reproduction. Can you talk about the contradictions within your use of, for example, Bloch's notion of non-simultaneity and something like Johannes Fabian's notion of coevalness in anthropology, which is used to show the temporalized separation produced by imperialism and colonialism to behind or underneath the developed? And do you have anything to say about the uneven and combined development of capitalism within the general notions of periodization, perhaps, within your presentation?
This is a great question. I had a whole section on Fabian actually that I was just like, oh my god, I can't like write this whole book for this this talk. But certainly, like, Fabian is in this idea, Fabian's translation of Ungleichzeitigkeit, which is a very challenging word to translate into English. It gets translated into non-contemporaneity, non-synchronicity. Non-simultaneity is the word I used right now, just because I like this idea of this dream of technology somehow becoming ever faster, like faster photographs, faster circulation, trying to narrow the gap in time delay. And Fabian translates Gleichzeitigkeit as coevalness, which is a very kind of deliberately, I want to say fancy word, but it's like it's a word that's not in common use, right? But it highlights the kind of strangeness, and I think with what he describes is a way in which concepts of chronology, of a kind of neutral time that is homogeneous, measurable by things like clocks and calendars, gives this illusion of objectivity to time, and just likewise another alternative model of time being cultural time, as time as a sequence of significant events capable of being ordered and classified in some kind of taxonomy. So on the one hand, you have the dream of taxonomy. On the other hand, you have the dream of objective chronology. And both of these models of time are what are at stake as being seen in conflict in these discourses about simultaneity, at least in the German tradition in which I've been dealing with. And Fabian says neither of those models get at an even greater occlusion of this this collapse between what is far away in space is therefore far away in time, right? That, whatever is far away from the European imagination on the globe is therefore timeless, eternal, primitive, underdeveloped, and so forth. And that this is something that the discourses of simultaneity themselves, even if they're called upon to explain this problem of how could there be unequal times in the same moment of the world history, that this discourse actually makes that harder to unpack. So yeah, I think I think that's a crucial way of kind of bringing in this particular modern history that I've been outlining into present practices, perhaps not oriented to the art world, but oriented to debates about repatriation that are happening in the museum. Like, I keep thinking about the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and isn't it isn't it curious that we have this facsimile of the Schloss being the house for these objects that seem to be so fraught in terms of where is their home and what time do they belong to? Do they belong to our time? Do they belong to some sort of frozen time of authentic making and so forth? That's where I feel Fabian's elaboration of simultaneity can add yet another tool. And I think some of the objects that Ursula showed, for example, the Aliari material speculation, you know, those three-dimensional prints of, you know, objects destroyed by ISIS, that is also similar to this Nefertiti hack that I showed at the beginning, where you have actually contemporary artists trying to play with the history of facsimile reproduction and the history of sculpture to think through these issues about ownership over the past in a way that is, I think, incredibly theoretically sophisticated, and one that seems a little less accelerationist. Like, I think sometimes the Additive Manifesto crew and even Larrick himself can seem a bit like, okay, we're in free fall in this kind of, you know, globalized, neoliberal, hyper-capital way. I think there's resistance to that also, and that can be found in the history of sculpture as an artifact of culture. So that's a long-winded answer to this complicated question, but I do feel as if like there's an intellectual history here that is absolutely worth mining. And so when I'm drawn to talk about contemporary art, i.e. contemporary to me today, like art being made now, I tend to focus on the people who are using discourses about art making to interrogate the spaces of display and collecting, precisely in this kind of, we're not really post-colonial yet, right? So, or at least the museums aren't. And so we have to think through that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have a question that really matches quite perfectly with what you've just been saying. So I read it. The history of sculpture in terms of its technological transformation tends to be narrated in a way that erasures any female or non-Western influences. This in turn reminds me of Michel Rolf-Trouillot's book Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. Here he writes that presences and absences of history are neither neutral nor natural. They are created. As such, they are not mere presences or absences, but mentions and silences of various kinds of degrees. So my question is, how can we as art historians, theorists, or curators start telling the story differently? And I don't know if you want to answer, Ursula, in view of the artists also that you've proposed in your paper. I think we can't hear you, so maybe you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, thank you. There was a short loss of connection. Maybe you could please repeat the last two sentences.
Sure. So the presences and absences of history are neither neutral nor natural. They are created. As such, they are not mere presences or absences, but mentions and silences of various kinds of degrees. So my question is, how can we as art historians, theorists, or curators start telling the story differently?
One way would be to discuss the objects that artworks that and artistic positions that deal with the questions themselves. Maybe as Maurice Alary did his in her work, material speculation, but also if we try to look at works by Young, the classical canon, right? And also what I really was striking me when I went through all the books written about the history of Western sculpture in the 20th century, and I counted the amount of female sculptures, I was really I was not really surprised, but it was really interesting to see what authors considered, or who of the authors considered certain female positions. So I really think it should be a challenge also for art history to rewrite, especially the history of sculpture, of female sculptures. And I mean, as curators, as scholars, we can really try to discuss and to talk about these different narratives. But genau, does this answer the question? Or because I'm sorry, due to technical problems, I was not sure if I understood everything, Patricia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you perfectly understood, and maybe
okay.
this exhaustion.
Sorry, because sometimes.
Yeah, I know our internet is starting to get weak, and it does so perfectly on time after 2 full hours, and maybe just the internet. We exhausted the internet with all this information, and I think I'll let it come to a close here. And thank you both, Ursula and Megan, for your absolutely brilliant and really wonderfully complimentary presentation. It was a delight to listen to both of you, and thank you very much for joining. And I thank our audience online who've been very patient with us, for still being here with us. And I hope to see everyone again tomorrow, again at 5 p.m. in the afternoon for our next panel titled Materializing Cyber Bodies Since the 1980s, with contributions by Janine Tang, Marie-Louise Angerer, and shared by my colleague Franziska Lienhardt. So I wish you all a very good night, evening, or day. Megan, in your case, I think it really is about to start, and hope to welcome everyone back tomorrow. Goodbye.